For Aristotle, the impossibility of a beginning and an end for time is an argument in favor of the idea of infinity. Time does not exist as an infinite given whole, for it is not in the nature of its parts to coexist. But unlike extension, time is potentially infinite from the point of view of addition. Time, like extension, is infinitely divisible, but not infinitely divided. Today we know that what is valid for space is also valid for time and vice versa, as Einstein showed us. Theoretically, the reality of the space-time block can be considered valid as a whole, although what is really valid is always the reality perceived by each individual observer. As a measure of motion, which is what time is, indeed infinite by addition, but it depends on observers to be measured as such. All movement, all time is relative, always depends on the observers to exist. It just doesn't make sense to speak in time without the presence of observers. Time does not have an objective nature different from that of relative movements, which only exist for observers, since they are always also a perfect situation of rest due to the continuity of space. The existence of the space-time block, the record of all movements that create the local measurements of space and time, is locally real just as movements are locally real. Every observer sees the block of space-time only at a point called now. Time is no different from extension, is no different from space in nature. Neither time nor space is infinitely divisible. These concepts disappear when subjected to a certain rigidity because they are always variation. The limit of observation limits the existence that is never autonomous, that is never absolute of these concepts. Like space, time is also continuous because it is always a continuous movement. The movement in turn is continuous because it occurs through continuous space. The idea range of previous and posterior relates to space, movement, and time. Regarding time, we can distinguish a before and an after, that is, two nows with a continuous interval between them. Of course, no continuum can be composed of indivisible parts, but the validity of the concepts of physics depends on the limits of observation. Just as all rest is a perfect continuum, just as all perfect rest is a nothingness, so too is time a continuum. For in being motion, it is always also a perfect rest, a continuous nothingness. Aristotle said, motion in turn is continuous because it takes place through a continuous space. If by virtue now time is numbered, we must not suppose that they are parts of time just as we do not suppose that points are parts of a line either. We fall back into nothingness, into the always relative validity of physical concepts. Man is limited in his observation. For man, there is indeed a minimum time and there is indeed a minimum line. Aristotle relates time to motion in general by stating that time is the countable aspect of motion, the number of motion with respect to before and after. For Aristotle, time and movement define each other. We know today that time is a standard measure of movement. Movement, variation, is the most basic, most fundamental concept. Not only do we measure movement by time, but also time by movement, because they define each other. The time marks movement, since it is its number, and movement marks time. Despite the small confusion, it is possible to understand what the philosopher means. We know today that the movement creates time. We use time as the standard measure of movement that it is for measuring other movements. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel and give your like if you enjoy it.